Okay, cool. Thank you for coming. So this is the final lecture of the series, and I'm very glad to have Aaron Cayer. He's a PhD candidate in architecture at the University of California, and also a lecturer at University of California of Los Angeles, and a lecturer at architecture and history and theory at Cal Poly Pomona. He's also a senior research associate at City Lab, an urban think tank within UCLA's Department of Architecture and Urban Design. I met Aaron at a review for Cal Poly, and I found his research topic particularly interesting. He's going to talk all about that, but I feel like the history, we take history for granted, almost as if it's, there's an important thing and it's kind of understood that someone's going to write the history, but I feel like it's more like the mining, right? Especially the recent history could get buried if no one does the mining and do the research and read the history or tell that story. So for that reason, I found his research particularly interesting. There's a lot of things that so his research focuses on this firm that actually, if you practice architecture in Los Angeles, you probably heard the name. So everyone knows about the firm, but no one knows very much about the firm. So, and there's a fascinating story behind it. So with that, I want to welcome Aaron.
Okay. I think there's a sign-up sheet for those here for continuing ed credits. Thanks, Yasushi, for the invitation and introduction, and to everyone for joining tonight. When I first read the theme for this fall lecture series, after I had been invited to speak about emerging practices, as a means to really highlight the ways in which architects are actively kind of reconceptualizing the possibilities of architectural work, I was asked by a colleague, well, how might one know that their practice has actually emerged? So my goal tonight will be to really address this question by taking an architectural practice that we might all recognize as one that has perhaps fully emerged, and to examine it historically. So I'm going to speak a bit about my doctoral research, which focuses on the shifting nature of architectural practice between the 1960s and 1990s, during which time corporate architectural firms really began to dramatically increase the scale and scope of architectural work as a way to kind of cope with the volatility of speculative urban economies. So in my dissertation, Design and Profit, Architectural Practice in the Age of Accumulation, I focused specifically on the history of a California architecture firm that began as a profit-sapping three-architect partnership named Daniel Mann Johnson Architects in 1946 in Santa Maria, California, later known as DMJM or DimJim. In its first 3 years, the three architects were nearly bankrupt. They were taking turns in the hospital due to stomach ulcers that were stress-induced. There were tall stacks of unpaid bills in their office, and they were essentially blaming each other for the firm's inability to make a profit. And as one business journal recalled at the time, it would be essentially only a matter of time before the firm would, quote, explode apart. However, the founding partners would be stunned to know that their firm would become the largest global architecture, engineering, and urban planning firm in the world, presently marked by its near 100,000 employees and over $18 billion in annual revenue, and in fact based here in Los Angeles under its new name, AECOM, since the 1990s. So I began my research by really asking, at a moment when many large-scale architecture firms such as Walter Gropius's The Architects Collaborative in Massachusetts, and in Texas, Cottle, Rowlett, and Scott, or CRS, were beginning to kind of collapse at the end of the 20th century. What were the conditions that made AECOM and these enduring corporate entities possible, and what were the architects within them actually required to do? So DimGim was a firm that was engaged in military projects both in the US and abroad during the 50s and 60s, including the nation's first underground intercontinental ballistic missile program, and later in massive infrastructure and city planning projects in the 70s and 80s. And it was a firm that classified its practices as those that looked beyond specialized building types such as commercial office towers or schools, which they viewed as programmatically narrow and too risky symbols of financialization, to consider the kind of substrate of technological, social, and political processes at work beneath them. So on the right is a massive housing complex that was proposed by architects Caesar Pelli and Anthony Lumsden in 1966, which was in fact never built. And on the left was a Baltimore rapid transit system that was designed by architects, engineers, and economists at DimGim during the 1970s. And between the 1950s and 1980s, the firm grew by acquiring and merging with a diverse array of firms to keep up with the demands of a speculative urban economy. And in 1976, the vice president of DimGim concluded that the professional conglomeration DimGim is called a multidisciplinary team, and DimGim was one of the very first firms in the post-World War II era to assemble such an organization. So in business literature, the word conglomerate is commonly used to describe a particular type of corporation that proliferated during the 1960s by acquiring and merging with other firms, often in very unrelated fields or geographies. In this particular instance, the verb conglomeration was used as a noun, referring to the kind of etymological roots of the word, meaning to ball together. But to take the origin of the word one step further, the core Latin root of the word glem and glom are generally associated and understood to mean to latch onto or to embrace. Therefore, the use of the term conglomeration by architects at DimGim really signaled a new culture of architectural practice that accepted the various manifestations of architectural work by measuring not what was or what was not architecture, but rather what was and what could be considered as such. I should note that despite this kind of emphatic rhetoric of novelty, the term conglomerate was not, and still is not, universally accepted by DimGim architects or business leaders, and several, in fact, very much strongly deny this assertion by citing the fact that all of the firms and subsidiaries of DimGim were in some ways related to architecture. But nonetheless, it still is an important discursive formation to look at. So in practice, DimGim took the shape of a firm of many firms within it. So here you can see a list of firms that were acquired, merged with, or developed by DimGim since the 1950s, and it's quite an extensive list that continues to grow. And it includes several really important architectural firms for Southern California, such as Keating, Mann, Jernigan, Rotet in 1994. Jernigan, for example, is the head of the Gensler office downtown in LA. To the noted landscape architecture firm Ekbo Dean Austin Williams, or EDA, in 2005, to Ellerby Architects in Welton Beckett in 2009. So Beckett's firm, as many of you know, produced many important buildings that peppered Los Angeles, including the Capitol Records building designed by Lou Nadorf. But within each firm, whether architects or engineers or technologists or economists, each additional person or service was understood to be social and economic equals. And well into the 1970s, in fact, the revenue generated by the engineers was matched by the revenue generated by architects. So DimGim's history began in 1946 as a 3- and quickly 4-person partnership in Santa Maria, where the young architects and former military officers Philip Daniel, Kenneth Johnson, and Arthur Mann formed a practice that was initially intended to focus only on school buildings and campuses. Johnson and Daniel were both classmates who graduated from the USC School of Architecture in 1937, and following the post-war construction boom, the trio moved back to Los Angeles, where draftsmen were much more plentiful and commissions were also more plentiful. And they added their loyal consulting engineer, Irv Mendenhall, to the firm as an equal partner in 1949, which was the same year that John Merrill was finally embraced as a full partner at SOM. So unlike SOM, however, in its Fordist assembly line flow of work where drawings were passed from design to engineering to construction, Mendenhall's addition resulted in a fully integrated architecture and engineering practice with all of the architecture and engineering done in-house, and with each group responsible for their own project. So despite a kind of promising construction boom and new office expansions, however, the first 3 years of work were financially turbulent, and the idea to specialize in only one type of project, schools, proved to be riddled with economic problems. So what did they do? So the first thing they did was they hired the first of many subsequent outsiders, in this case a management consulting firm that continues to really operate as an important government contractor named Booz, Allen & Hamilton, which is a firm that many of you are likely familiar with due to the leaking of classified NSA documents by their employee Edward Snowden, to really help them gain financial traction. So upon the arrival to DimGym, the leading consultant named Douglas Russell found work unbilled, bills uncollected, business details left totally unattended, and he outlined a new structure for DimGym that was based on the structure of Booz Allen Hamilton itself, requiring that all architects sign a new code of ethics that emphasized objectivity and dispassion, requiring them to view each other as true counterparts. It read in part an unwillingness on the part of all members ever to speak disparagingly of another member to anyone, and a willingness on the part of all members to face all firm problems objectively and dispassionately. So this emphasis on dispassion and the eradication of any personal disagreements was described by a notable sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, as a kind of a particular characteristic of large-scale cultural production, in which he borrowed Milton Friedman's 1970s quip to argue that, unlike smaller avant-gardist cultural practices, business is business, and as such, there's no room in business for feelings. So Russell's report concluded by arguing that architecture firms most likely to thrive after the war would be those that firstly integrated architecture and engineering services, secondly, that recognized that each contributing professional should be understood as both social and economic equals. Thirdly, he argued that project-type specialization subjected the firm to peaks and valleys of business, and thus a diversity of project types, from schools to military to commercial and industrial projects, was a primary way to maintain and ensure overall profitability. So by the late 1950s, Russell left, and Mendenhall, the engineer, assumed the position of president. And a firm organization chart both reflected an emphasis on business planning and supervision, as well as an emerging separation between drawing labor and actual business labor, which is a testament to a kind of post-Fordist economy of work, wherein manual labor inputs were not necessarily correlated to profit outputs. Or in other words, one could start to make money without putting in any manual labor, such as drawing. So this chart reflects an emphasis on the periphery to new markets and clients and external relationships, and no project specialization. So each partner was assigned a role as an executive vice president, and it was responsible for duties both on the corporate board of directors as well as for the marketing of new work. So the chart features a dashed line subsection of organization for clients and projects, which was distinct from the rest and which highlighted this emerging separation between drawing work, or operations, and business work. So Daniel was responsible for, quote, commercial and systems operation, Mann oversaw institutional projects, Johnson oversaw literally, quote, the military industrial division, and Mendenhall was responsible for engineering projects. So these external relationships provided both stability and a constant stream of diversified projects to the office, which began to direct attention toward the fringes of the firm's existing skills and expertise. So in 1960, DimJim filed its papers for incorporation, and so unlike a partnership, a corporation allowed them to readily acquire firms beyond their own, since the corporation as a legal entity functioned much like an individual. So its individual articles of incorporation attempted to kind of rid it of any authorial individuality except in its name, defining itself as a human-like body able to, quote, acquire by purchase or otherwise the goodwill, business, property rights, franchises, and assets of every kind, of any person, firm, association, or corporation. So therefore, as new expertise was needed, entire companies and their assets were acquired rather than just merely hiring the chief laborer himself, which was a strategy for inflating the experiential capacity of the firm and mitigating competition. So as a direct result of incorporation and the increased division of work, new standards were required to be written, including incredibly detailed business procedures, organizational charts, and contracts, which constituted a kind of alternative kind of architectural work, as distinct from that which is typically associated with architectural design or drawing. So the documents were compiled in this standard practices manual, which outlined organizational goals, hierarchies, as well as specific protocols and procedures in excruciating detail. For instance, the manual detailed protocols and uniform rules that ranged from, from a maximum age of employees to 65 years old, that's it, to a maximum allocation of money to be spent on flowers as condolence gifts for the death of employees' families, even to a mandatory maternity, quote, termination for women after their 6th month of pregnancy. So yes, this meant they weren't expected to return. So additionally, the manual included a section dedicated to intra-company relationships, which described the firm as non-hierarchical in its social structure and explicitly oriented outward. So the most direct of the intra-company goals was outlined to emphasize, quote, the peripheral organizational elements which constitute our primary relationships to the outside world and clientele. So as DimJim began forming alliances with affiliated companies and acquiring additional firms, the logic and disciplinary boundary of the practice itself became more porous, and following this post-Fortis separation of disengaging labor from capital, they argue that the revenue accumulated by the direct labor of architects, so the production of drawings for buildings and infrastructure, would not be quite enough to maintain a position of stable economic power. So instead, affiliated companies were laterally formed or invested in to be renewable sources of capital. This emphasis on the periphery is really outlined and reflected in this revised organizational chart in 1972, where a list of affiliate organizations problematized the idea of an organizational chart altogether based on lines that literally linked the functions together. So now indirect sources of capital from real estate to technology to publishing services were entirely removed from the firm. And labor was described in direct opposition to capital. So DimJim was argued to be, quote, labor intensive, meaning that it was still focused on the manual production of drawings, while its accumulated subsidiaries and affiliated companies would be, quote, capital extensive, focusing on alternative services with which to generate revenue. So more broadly, architectural work across the US was being subjected to new measures of evaluation, as a 1961 Engineering News record described firms as either winners or losers, based principally on their ability to be, quote, money makers. So the editors of the journal noted that many firms, quote, beat the market with profitable sidelines by forming capital-heavy supplemental practices that could support those that were more traditionally labor-heavy. So by the 1970s, firms with profitable sidelines began to appear in the news record, which began to publish an annual ranking of top 500 design firms that, beginning in 1964, and that really continues to today, until today, that provides an alternative metric of merit to design awards. So the firms that were ranked at the top were those that were increasingly defined as firms with multiple firms within them, and the subsidiaries that allow them to bridge between, architecture and planning and engineering. However, throughout the 1970s, the subsidiaries were relatively few and could kind of be listed as footnotes in the annual E&R reports. But by the 1980s, however, entire pages were dedicated to listing these designer affiliates and subsidiaries, with DimGim inching closer to the top 10, and with firms above it, including the Plan and Research Corporation, that would later become part of DimGim's own collection. So what you're looking at is essentially lists of subsidiary firms that occupy positions within other firms. So by the mid-1970s, DimGim had surged to 700 employees, and the firm's services were expanded to include nearly 22 different services, and it defined itself as a planning, architecture, engineering, systems, and economics firm. So despite drastic reductions in profits of many architecture firms as a result of the recession during the mid-1970s, DimGim actually recorded gross revenue and profits at an all-time high. And in 1974, an entire financial section was added to the Standards Business Manual to define, in fact, what a subsidiary was, some of which they refer to as affiliate friends, as seen here in a DimGim newsletter. And the term subsidiary and affiliate were collectively referred to as subs, in which DimGim had a direct ownership interest of 20% or greater. So subs range from Hilton Engineers of Portland, Oregon in 1974 to the architecture and engineering firms such as New Orleans-based Curtis and Davis in 1976, to Real Estate Technology here in LA, which was part of the company Real Estate Resources that DimGim Vice President Tef Katai co-owned. So Realtech was intended to be able to take larger financial risks in land acquisition to quickly turn over into equity. And an architectural illustration of the working relationship between DimGim and Realtech came in 1971 when Realtech acquired the land to develop DimGim's own 22-story office building, One Park Plaza, which was designed by DimGim architect Anthony Lumsden on Wilshire Boulevard. So within the building, the floor plan was conceptualized as entirely open to prioritize the sense of horizontality over verticality, and the building symbolized and housed DimGim's then 700-person team. So the floor plan of the DimGim office that you're seeing here was organized around codependent groups on the 4th floor, which was referred to as the main production area. And the design area was centered in a sea of other departments with supporting services such as engineering and production kind of radiating outward. So it was differentiated from the architecture area, however, where most of the drawing, production, and drafting was done. And the corporate offices, which included the accounting and personnel and communications, were lofted on the 5th floor. So even though they defined themselves as true equals, they were still in some ways hierarchically structured in the building. Another key subsidiary was the company named Hump, which was developed by founding architect Philip Daniel, initially for the U.S. Corps of Engineers Research Laboratory, of which DimGim held 10% interest, and which provided and maintained all computer and communication equipment for DimGim, as well as other independent companies. since Daniel predicted that computer-aided engineering and in architectural design, quotes, and automation would be the way forward. So on the left you can see a DimGym UNIVAC 9300 data communication system. No, those are not washing machines. And it was used in tandem with an 1108S, which provided the pulse to the computation process, and which was operated primarily by women as part of secretarial work, though there were also very important women who were also architects. So with additional offshoots that included a space planning and interior design company called Associated Design Planning and Art, or ADPA, a construction contract management company named Adadeco, which was actually a shell that was used for other services such as master planning and surveillance for the government. DimGym actually owned their own airplane. Even a cosmic X-ray firm named American Science and Engineering. And so DimGym had really become a complete package of services and a kind of nexus of diversified yet very stable capital. So just as the practice was defined in contextual terms, one of the business leaders argued that the emphasis in subsequent decades would not be on identifying key project types, but on the total social and environmental context of a project. And this would really require a broad multidisciplinary structure that was capable of reaching beneath project-specialized work and the geographies of other firms. So he imagined DimGym to be process-driven and everywhere. He explained, "We were not going to be a school firm like Perkinson Will. We were not going to be a high-rise firm like SOM. We were going to be everywhere, because my own observation was that things went up and down due to funding. The Northeast might be dead, and the Southwest might be booming. School buildings might be the biggest thing in the world, and then highways might be booming. It would cost us money. When a discipline or region went down, we would pay a price for it, but overall we would be steady." And in fact, the city was defined as the site for the architect. The concept of an urban system was imagined as a framework through which to design the underlying urban environment and the structures that mirrored the philosophy of the practice itself. So the city, like the firm, was comprised of social, economic, political, and physical subsystems. He argued that for DimGym, total design meant to begin with the backdrop, to begin with the, quote, bare land or empty space and move step by step toward the goal of an environment for man's enjoyment. So drawn as a kind of circular urban system, this diagram for an experimental city was comprised of 12 subsystems, each of which was outlined as a bounded component that neither touched nor overlapped any others. And like the services offered by DimGym, this urban system was comprehensive. So architecture was designated as only a part of this, the physical attributes of the city, not at all touching the political or economic components, and as a direct opposite, in fact, to the non-material social and cultural subsystems on the other side of this diagram. But when we take into account the broader range of practices and the kind of expanded scope of work that the architects were actively engaged in through subsidiaries and affiliated companies, the field of architecture was actually much, much wider. And so the growth of the practice, we could say, went hand in hand with the process of urbanization. So while the practice itself was understood as a kind of urban system of subsystems and a kind of socioeconomic infrastructure, the type of built projects that DimGym's architects were designing were similarly defined in terms of infrastructure, and many of them were entirely out of sight. So during World War II, for example, the partners of DimGym had amassed a significant number of direct connections with Air Force and commanders of military bases. And one of the most substantial series of commissions that really propelled the firm economically in the late 1950s was the design of a Cold War prototype for the first completely underground intercontinental ballistic missile system known as the Titan I. I guess when I first started doing this research, I had no idea that it would have such contemporary relevance. And so the Titan I was thought to be the first fully hardened and underground missile complex that the U.S. had ever built. And so it really represented a pivotal shift in terms of architecture for missile systems, since the missiles required structures to protect them. So DimJim's founding partner Ken Johnson was the manager for the project, and he organized a collection of firms titled DimJim and Associates, which included a firm specializing in tunnel design, one specializing in concrete, and another focusing on chemical engineering. So the missile program was foregrounded as the nation's principal system of nuclear deterrence, rather than civil defense. So we're not talking about bunkers and a kind of fallout program. So it was really designed to instill a sense of fear into the minds of aggressors and to discourage them from attacking the US altogether. So on the left is an image of a constructed Titan I missile silo at Vandenberg Air Force Base here in California, which was the site where the first Titan training and testing facilities were constructed for the Titan. And perhaps more interestingly, on the right is a softly focused kind of grayscale hand rendering of the Titan, which was included in DimJim's portfolio for the project, but was interestingly not part or not the work of an architect nor an engineer of DimJim. Instead, it was actually the work of an Oscar-winning Hollywood art director named Jack Martin Smith, who was a fellow USC classmate of and graduate of the DimJim partners, known for his work as a production designer for films such as The Wizard of Oz in 1939, and later for Cleopatra in 1963, Hello Dolly in 1969. So, like the military tests, the tests of missiles and nuclear bombs during the Cold War, we might argue that that such a rendering also served as an important deterring function through its kind of impressive dramatization. So each Titan complex was a massive undertaking akin to constructing an entire city. So the amount of concrete, just for some context, was enough to form 1,100 residential foundations, enough electricity to supply 400 houses, and enough air conditioning capacity for 200. And it required really an entirely new type of protective structure for the missile, including missile silos, as well as buried control centers and powerhouses to give the US a second strike capability, which meant that it was a capability to absorb a nuclear bomb and an overpressure of about 100 pounds per square inch, which is about the equivalent of the force of 50 times the force of gravity, and still be able to fire back. So they were built, these sites were built across the country in South Dakota, in Washington, in Colorado, and two of which were here in California. And each Titan I site configuration included 9 missile launchers that were arranged in a kind of 3x3 configuration. So it was a configuration that DimJim's team, in fact, proposed as a result of their decentralized business efforts. So the government actually suggested at first that all of the sites should be planned as a 9x1 configuration, meaning that all of the missiles would be clustered together in one site, but they could easily be wiped out with one strike, essentially. So this is a site plan of one of the 3 complexes. This one was at Lowry Air Force Base in Colorado. That would be essentially similarly replicated at every site. And so there were 3 of these complexes essentially at every single site, and they were spaced 12 to 18 miles apart. So if one complex, so if this complex was struck, for example, there would still be 2 others far enough away to still fire back. And just so you all sleep very well tonight, I've included a more recent map of missile-based locations, just for some greater context, which included the Titan II program that quickly outmoded the Titan I, and then the Missile Men program, which are still very active today. And but with each revision, there was a less and less a requirement for architects to design these kind of protective structures. So the DimGem partners, however, didn't want to only be known as what they refer to as industrial architects and engineers. So they hired some architects named Caesar Pelli and Anthony Lumsden, who were both working for Eero Saarinen's office and then Roshan Dinkalu. And so they were hired in 1964 to help DimGem bring together the ideas of business management with the ideas of urban systems design. And so, while Pelli left in 1968 to go work for Victor Gruen, Lumsden became kind of enmeshed in the corporate milieu of DimGem, and he really tried to establish a material connection between the logics of urban form and economics. So he really loved the kind of nitty-gritty of business. So in the office, Lumsden actually insisted that DimGem was not compatible with a system of what he referred to as a star system of architects. So this system, he argued, privileged a priori design decisions that promoted an attitude of withdrawal from the immediate processes and the tools of architectural work, such as the economic and technological underpinnings of a project. So he avoided such a system by associating it with Albert Camus's 1947 novel, The Plague, and asserted that DimGem does not allow saints on the staff, even if they are counting money instead of peas. Neither as an attitude for the profession nor in buildings as a product is withdrawal a possible position for a contributing design firm. So he rooted his architectural work within the urban realm, designing office buildings along the Wilshire Corridor, as well as transportation systems, master plans, and even sewer treatment plants. So he argued that one of the notable structures here that he designed was the Tillman wastewater reclamation plant, in which he argued was the clearest manifestation of his work. So the Tumen wastewater reclamation plant was constructed in Van Nuys in 1984, and it was the single largest public works project ever built in LA at the time. And it was the Tillman Project was required to allow the city to expand anymore further north. And it was referred to as a kind of civil engineering cum architecture project for LA's Bureau of Engineering. But city residents were fiercely opposed to the idea that the city was rapidly expanding, and so the city's Cultural Affairs Commission became involved, approving projects that were only literally, quote, honest to the infrastructural systems in a way that could engage the public. So here you can see the kind of the site for the project, just at the kind of tip of the 405. And fascinated by the ways in which wastewater flowed from one treatment process to the next, Lumsden asked, well, do you disguise, say, a sewer treatment plant's functions by prettying it up with fake mansard roofs and roses around the door? Or do you take the more sophisticated route of developing a design that honestly expresses what goes on inside and find a way to turn that into interesting architecture? So set within a Japanese garden, the plant was intended to serve 400,000 people and to process up to 85 million gallons of water per day, or essentially 24% of the city's wastewater. And the complex included an administration building, laboratories, as well as a series of processing chambers and channels that reclaim and recycle the wastewater. So you're looking at the administration building here, and the kind of rolling metal and glass membrane kind of metaphorically cascades over the administration's structural bones, like the facility's wastewater reclamation activity, falling to a lake in the front, and its flat-faced east facade faces the rear where the water enters the treatment plant. So the treatment plant was featured as both an infrastructural backdrop for the city, literally as city infrastructure, as well as a literal backdrop for popular journals and films, including Hollywood films such as Star Trek. And in plan, the site also stands as a diagram for the practice, since viewing towers, so I'm referring to viewing towers here in plan, extended outward from the administration building. So one stretched eastward out and over the vast and kind of pungent treatment process behind the administration building, which was designed by the process was designed by engineers, while the other arm extended to the north of the building with views out to the gardens and the lake below. The gardens were designed by the noted Japanese architect Kyoichi Kawano. So if we take a step back to kind of consider the architectural projects of DimJim as all infrastructural in some way, from missile sites to water treatment plants, each really had an active role in the kind of political economy. And at the same time, they also had important economic affects for DimJim and the firm itself. So by the mid-1980s, the process of diversified conglomeration, which was first started by industrial firms such as DuPont and Teledyne and General Electric, began to rise in service professions since it offered a greater ability to borrow in a capitalist market, as well as to evade government antitrust sanctions that were targeting mono-industry monopolies. And one example of this, and the way in which DimJim became enrolled, was a Kentucky-based Ashland Oil Company, which, like many petroleum companies at the time, announced that it would need to shift away from just strict oil refinery and gasoline to more diversified, high-technology products and services for greater economic stability. So its chief operating officer, John Hall, noted that, quote, "Back in the 1960s, our chief strategy was to push more oil through the refineries, make more gasoline, sell more gasoline. It doesn't work like that anymore. The world has changed. You've got to have a different twist." So unlike oil giants Exxon Corporation and the Gulf Oil Corporation, Ashland had to think more broadly to maintain stability, being careful not to put all of its eggs in one barrel. So to do so, it aimed drastically to reduce its petroleum profits quite significantly to 35 to 40% of its total revenue, and to build earnings from related non-refining businesses. So Ashland formed a chemical division as well as an engineering and construction division because it had purchased companies that happened to have architecture and engineering already within them, including Holmes and Narver and Williams Brother Engineering. So ambitious in their venturing into architecture and engineering, and without really any expertise in architecture or engineering, they acquired DimJim so that its corporate leadership could manage the architecture and engineering companies. So DimJim was acquired in 1984, and they formed a holding company named Ashland Technology Corporation in 1985. But DimJim's architectural projects and its design capabilities were what were broadcasted and featured most prominently in many of Ashland's annual reports to its shareholders, citing DimJim as a consistently ranked leading design firm with an international reputation for outstanding design, technological advances, strong project management, and strict cost and schedule control. So it was in this particular 1984 annual report that the economic value of Lumsden's efforts were most revealed, though he nor any architect was even mentioned. And the Tillman Project, as you can see here, was broadcasted as a kind of infrastructural landmark for Los Angeles, not because of its material rigor or sophisticated design, but rather because it was capable of treating 40 million gallons of water per day for irrigation and recreation uses in California's San Fernando Valley. And so just as the wastewater kind of flowed into and out of the treatment plant, Ashland Oil dipped into and out of the engineering and construction industry after its finances strengthened, but it implanted an emergentist desire within DimJim a thirst for more subsidiaries, greater economic breadth, and for more affiliate friends. So by 1990, Ashland began withdrawing from the engineering business and selling a majority interest in Ashland Technology in an employee-led buyback, and a new company name formed, AECOM Technology Corporation, that consisted of 5 companies, of which DimGem was one. But the leadership of DimGem maintained the leadership of AECOM Technology. So the firm's new name, and I apologize that the left-hand side is dark. The most important thing is the bottom, which says AECOM. So the firm's new name, AECOM, was kind of reduced to its anonymized services and was no longer attached to the names of the founding partners. And in its first annual report, which is seen here, the names of all of the employees were printed across several pages in very tiny font in alphabetical order with justified text to conform to the kind of margins of the page. And the kind of block of individual names might be read just like a material, so they were embodiments of experience, of assembly, of money, of work, that demonstrated to the shareholders a sense of uniform, non-hierarchical affective strength. But the new name, AECOM, provided for future flexibilities and open-ended possibilities. So A and E were relatively clear and straightforward, so architecture and engineering. Yet the COM was specifically left open-ended. It could be used to suggest construction, operations, and management, or contracts, operations, and maintenance, or construction management, depending on the time and allowing for open-ended possibilities as the firm would inevitably change. So, although one might argue that the architects at DimGem in some ways undermined or helped expunge the historical role of the architect, I argue that the history of DimGem and the discourse of conglomeration illustrated one way in which corporate architects after the 1960s were able to carve out an expanded terrain of architectural practice. So embedded within diversified streams of revenue, architects provided economic stability to their firm by imagining not only how their work was subjected to the political and economic forces of capital around them, but actually how they could contribute to, intervene in, and reshape them. So this first meant that the architects were required to recognize their work as work, with value akin to other urban practitioners, from planners to engineers to economists to landscape architects, and the list goes on and on and on. And secondly, it meant that without an unabashed interest in the nitty-gritty details of business or the process of making money, the projects would not have been possible. So to return to the beginning premise of this lecture series of emerging practices, we might argue that the history of DimGem, and thus of AECOM, offers a view into an architecture firm as one whose ability to endure was predicated on an open-ended view of architectural possibility that we might describe as perpetually emerging. Thank you.